For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me for Suttner's View, a weekly commentary on South Africa's political scene. Welcome, Raymond.
Thank you.
In discussing lessons of Chris Hani's life, are you not cynical about the way the ANC allies use his life story or the anniversary of his death to their own means?
I think it's understandable that people will invoke the names of a number of heroes for their own political advantage. And in some cases, it's not purely cynical. In the course of the struggle, for example, the ANC had a radio station, Radio Freedom, and they would start off the program by referring to 19th century liberation resistors to colonialism. And I think for people who listen to these broadcasts, they used to locate themselves. They could see that they belonged to a long line of people who had resisted apartheid and fought for freedom. So when people invoke the name of Chris Hani, there can be a pure motive in the sense that Chris Hani stands for sacrifice, a willingness to sacrifice your life for freedom. Of course, when people are conducting themselves in a manner that is very different from Chris Hani, one can say that it's a bit cynical. For example, you have a poster, I think it's the South African Communist Party, a poster saying, "Vote for Chris Hani, vote ANC." Now, it's a direct attempt to associate Chris Hani with what is being done by the government of the day. And in a sense, the name Chris Hani may be seen as being used to rub out the violence in Marikana, the corruption in Kandla and other situations. But even if that is the case, when someone's name is in the public domain, and I myself do draw on Chris Hani, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Albert Luthuli, I do this because we need to discuss the type of leadership that we want in South Africa. Insofar as the four people I've mentioned are all men, we need to discuss the model of masculinity that they represent. Now, these posters and these references by the ANC and its allies are not really meant to get a debate going. They're really wanting to legitimate themselves through this name. But what we need to do is to say, you invoke that name. What exactly does that life teach us that is relevant for our present? And there are lessons that we need to interrogate in the life of Chris Hani, Ruth First, Lillian Ngoyi, Bram Fisher, and many others.
On that note, what do you think the lessons of Hani's life could be for South Africans today?
Chris Hani has an image which is the closest that you will get to someone like Che Guevara. He is a romantic soldier, handsome, fit, peak fitness, also smiling, jovial, and so his imagery is very, very significant. But what I think is very important is Hani, like Che Guevara, was not interested only in the military. He was not interested, if he had a soldier under him as a commander, he was not only interested in whether this man or woman knew how to shoot a particular sophisticated weapon. he was not only interested in whether they were well trained militarily. What distinguished Hani from very many others is that he was concerned about the human beings who were in the ANC's army. He wanted to understand if someone was supposed to cross the border and see military action in South Africa, he wanted to understand not only whether they had all the weapons that they needed, but whether they were actually ready. He was very concerned to assure people that if they said they were not ready, they were not cowardly. And no one would call them cowards, because he didn't want people to cross the border if they were not psychologically ready. If they had some unfinished business, some personal problems that were bothering them, he was concerned to find out if this was the case, so that if, when they found themselves in some difficult situation, they were not handicapped by having this baggage as well. Also, Hani, fitting into this concern for human beings, Hani knew everyone's names. He would, if he were chairing a meeting, he would say so-and-so and so-and-so, and he would remember people who he'd seen 10 years before, remember their names. He was also very much opposed to the use of hierarchies in a people's army. He used to spend his nights sitting with the young recruits, finding out where they came from, finding out about their lives, what their problems were. And one of the people who I interviewed about Hani said to me, I would discuss with Comrade Chris things which I wouldn't have even said to my mum. So people had a sense that I think we need to remember, when these young people went over the border, many of them needed to talk to someone who was like a parent to them. Now, Hani was both a comrade and a parent, but he was also someone who was concerned about the advancement of women in the army. At a certain stage, women who were trained in the same way as men were nevertheless given combat-related activities, for example, communication. They were not sent into combat situations. Hani said, if this is a people's army, if we are all trained the same way, women, like men, must face danger, must be put into combat situations. But he was also aware of the fact that there was abuse, and that many young women would come into the army as new recruits, and the officers, especially people who held powerful positions, would make a beeline for these young women. And Hani introduced a new regulation, a Rule 25, I think it was, which said that no officer could have a relationship with a new recruit until they had a certain amount of time to settle in, find their way, understand what was going on. So Chris Hani introduced some people to thinking about feminism while they were in the MK camps. And when he came back into the Communist Party, there was talk at one stage of calling the Communist Party a socialist feminist party. So another reason why Hani would not be a good figure to invoke in the present very patriarchal Zumaite type of government is that Hani stood for gender equality. A final point I want to make about Hani is that around 1992, 1993, after he'd been elected General Secretary of the Communist Party, he resigned from the ANC National Working Committee to devote himself to the activities of the Communist Party. He took that step, he explained, because he was not interested in a position in government.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to devote himself to the poorest of the poor, especially the working class. So he took an anti-career decision. Now, I think we can't conclude from that no one should go into government or no communist should go into government, but it's clear that Hani was not at all concerned. He said in one interview, everyone wants a good salary, but I'm not interested in office for office's sake or high positions and things like this. What I want to do is to advance these goals. And I don't think he would have condemned people necessarily for going into government, but he would have been critical if they had used their positions in government to enrich themselves or to advance policies that were antagonistic to the needs of the poorest of the poor. Okay.
Thank you very much for your insight.
Okay.
That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking about politics and elections in South Africa.